The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled under a blanket of deceptive tranquility, the kind of stillness that usually suggested nothing more scandalous than a misplaced knitting needle or a slightly overbaked sponge cake. The moon, a sharp silver sickle, hung suspended over the thatched roofs, casting long, skeletal shadows across the gravel paths of the vicarage garden. It was a Tuesday evening, a night traditionally reserved for the meeting of the local history society, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and late-blooming jasmine. Miss Marple, peering through the lace curtains of her bedroom window while adjusting her nightcap, noticed that the lights in the neighbouring Gossington Hall were burning far later than usual. She observed the silhouette of a Carno, a local vehicle, but a heavy, dark saloon tearing down the narrow lane, with a reckless disregard for the village's sleeping inhabitants. The peace was shattered at precisely 12 minutes past midnight. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sharp, high-pitched cry that seemed to vibrate through the very glass of the windows. It was a sound of absolute, unadulterated terror, ending as abruptly as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her keen blue eyes fixed on the line of elm trees that bordered the old footpath near the churchyard. She noticed a sudden flicker of a flashlight, a brief, frantic arc of light that disappeared into the undergrowth, followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a gate swinging shut. To anyone else, it might have been the wind or a stray animal, but Miss Marple knew the sounds of St. Mary Mead, and she knew the tension of her own knitting. This was the sound of a human life being interrupted. By dawn, the village was no longer a place of quiet gardens and morning tea. The cry in the night had been followed by a discovery that turned the local constabulary's morning into a frantic scramble. Sir Richard Haydon, a man of immense wealth and even greater arrogance, who had recently moved into the refurbished manor on the hill, was found slumped against the stone lich-gate of the church. He was dressed in evening wear, his silk cravat slightly askew and his face frozen in a mask of profound, indignant surprise. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no blood on the ancient stones, and no weapon in sight. He looked merely as if he had stopped to catch his breath and simply forgotten to start again. However, Dr. Haydock, summoned hastily from his bed, noted the peculiar bluish tint to the dead man's lips and the faint, unmistakable scent of crushed laurel leaves that seemed to hang about the body like a heavy perfume. The news spread through the village with the speed of a summer gale. By the time the milkman had finished his rounds, every household was buzzing with the scandal. Sir Richard had been a polarizing figure, a man who had bought his way into the county's graces while simultaneously stepping on the toes of every local tradesman and minor gentry. He had been involved in a contentious plan to develop the old meadow into a series of modern villas, a project that threatened the very character of St. Mary Mead. As the police began to cordon off the churchyard, Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. She watched the way the village reacted, the way Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her throat in theatrical shock, and the way the young gardener at the manor, a lad named Peter, stood perfectly still near the hedge, his face a ghastly shade of white. The hook had been baited, and the village was already rising to it. Inspector Slack, arriving in a cloud of self-importance and exhaust fumes, was already barking orders and demanding to see the guest list for the dinner party Sir Richard had hosted the previous evening. But Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. She was looking at a small silver snuff box lying half-hidden in the long grass several yards away from the body-on object that didn't belong to Sir Richard, but which she recognized as having sat on the mantelpiece of a very different house in the village only 2 days prior. The cry in the night had been silenced, but for Miss Marple, the conversation was only just beginning. The ordinary routine of St. Mary Mead had been disrupted by a crime that was as calculated as it was cruel, and as she adjusted her spectacles, she knew that the secret to the murder lay not in the manor on the hill, but in the small, seemingly insignificant resentments that had been simmering behind the village's polished front doors for years. The transition from the chilling silence of the midnight discovery to the feverish atmosphere of the following morning was as swift as a summer storm. By the time the sun had fully cleared the thatched gables of St. Mary Mead, the village had transformed into a living hive of speculation and whispered judgment. At the post office, the queue for stamps was 4 times its usual length, though it was quite clear that no one was particularly interested in postage. Mrs. Price Ridley, standing at the centre of a rapt circle of neighbours, was already providing a vivid, if entirely imaginative, account of the events. She claimed to have seen a sinister, cloaked figure prowling near the churchyard as early as 10 o'clock, a figure she was certain had the distinctive, broad-shouldered gait of a disgruntled Londoner. To Mrs. Price Ridley, the crime was an invasion and external pollutant brought in by Sir Richard's city connections, which comfortably removed the possibility that any decent local could be involved in such a messy business. However, beneath this layer of theatrical shock, a sharper and more pointed form of gossip was beginning to take root. Miss Marple, seated in her small drawing room with the window slightly ajar, watched as the village processed the news like a complex chemical reaction. She noted that while the louder voices blamed outsiders, the quieter ones were directed toward the manor's own domestic staff. It was whispered that the young gardener, Peter, had been seen arguing with Sir Richard over a dismissal notice only 2 days prior. Others suggested that the new valet, a man with a suspiciously polished accent and even more suspicious references, had been seen taking a late-night stroll in the direction of the Lich Gate. Each theory offered by the villagers was a mirror of their own prejudices. The upper-class residents looked toward the servants, while the tradespeople looked toward the city sharks Sir Richard had invited to his table. The Blue Boar's reaction was more focused. Here, the talk was not of cloaked figures, but of the contentious development project. Sir Richard's plan to build villas on the old meadow had threatened to ruin the livelihood of several local farmers and obstruct the view of the more established gentry. It was pointed out that the colonel, usually a man of rigid self-control, had been heard in the village shop, promising to see Haydon in his grave before a single brick was laid on that meadow. Such statements, which would have been dismissed as mere bluster a week ago, now carried the weight of a potential motive. The village was rapidly turning into a court of public opinion, where every past grievance and heated word was being weighed and measured against the cold reality of the body at the Lich Gate. Miss Marple listened as her maid, Cherry, recounted the latest developments while polishing the brasses. Cherry mentioned that the dinner party at the manor had ended in a decided chill, with several guests leaving earlier than expected. Apparently, Sir Richard had made a series of cutting remarks about the stagnation of village life and the inevitability of progress, which had not sat well with the local vicar or the doctor. This information was particularly interesting to Miss Marple. It wasn't the significant news that caught her ear, but the small, human reactions. The way the vicar had supposedly dropped his dessert spoon in a fit of pique, and the way the doctor had suddenly found he had an urgent case to attend to. In Sant, Mary Mead, a dropped spoon was often more telling than a loud argument. The gossip was not merely a way of passing the time, it was a collective effort to manage the fear. By categorizing the murder by a specific grudge or an outside threat, the villagers were trying to convince themselves that they were still safe. They were building a narrative that allowed them to keep their own secrets tucked away while exposing the flaws of others. Miss Marple adjusted her knitting, her mind drawing a parallel to the time the churchwarden's daughter had run away to join the Theatre Revrillon, had blamed the influence of a visiting troupe, when in fact it was the unbearable pressure of a perfectly maintained household that had caused the break. The village was looking for a villain who fit a certain mould, but Miss Marple knew that real villains were rarely so obliging. As the morning wore on, the initial shock began to harden into a pervasive sense of suspicion. Neighbours who had shared tea for decades now looked at each other with a new, guarded sharpness. The cry in the night had echoed through every house, and as the theories grew more elaborate, the truth became more obscured by the layers of village pride and personal resentment. Miss Marple watched a black car pull up to the vicarage and realized that Inspector Slack would soon be inundated with helpful tips that were nothing more than local scores being settled. The village was reacting exactly as it always did be, projecting its own shadows onto the nearest convenient target. The real darkness remained nestled exactly where it had always been, hidden in the mundane details of a Tuesday night. The following morning the sun rose over St. Mary Mead with a clarity that seemed to mock the murky nature of the previous night's events, while Inspector Slack was busy organising a systematic search of the churchyard and demanding a list of every guest who had attended Sir Richard's ill-fated dinner. Miss Marple was occupied with her own, far more delicate form of investigation. She spent her morning in the small, sun-drenched parlour of Mrs. Price Ridley, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming parish bazaar, but her real focus was on the subtle choreography of village life as viewed through the window. To the inspector, the murder was a problem of physics, time of death, the nature of the toxin, and the physical presence of suspects. To Miss Marple, however, it was a problem of patterns, and she had already noticed 3 distinct breaks in the village's habitual rhythm. The first pattern involved the vicar, who was usually the very soul of punctuality. He had failed to take his customary morning walk to the post office, a ritual he had not missed in 7 years. When he finally appeared on the green, his movements were hurried and defensive, and he kept his chin tucked into his collar, as if avoiding a draught. The second break was more subtle. The local apothecary, Mr. Gillingham, had closed his shop for inventory at 10 o'clock, an hour when the village was usually teeming with trade. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked a thoughtful tempo as she recalled the apothecary's father, who had once been involved in a very similar situation regarding a missing bottle of sedative. The third and perhaps most telling observation was the behaviour of Lady Trixie, Sir Richard's sister, who had arrived at the manor only that morning. Instead of the expected display of grief, she was seen in the rose garden, engaged in a very animated and seemingly cheerful conversation with the young gardener, Peter. Miss Marple's early investigation was rooted in the understanding that when a large stone is thrown into a pond, the ripples are most revealing where they hit the shore. She left Mrs. Price Ridley's and made her way toward the chemist's, where she encountered Dr. Haydock emerging from his surgery. The doctor looked aged and remarkably haggard. They spoke briefly of the terrible business, and the doctor mentioned, with a curious tremor in his voice, that the cause of death appeared to be a concentrated form of alkaloid poisoning, likely derived from a plant source. He seemed particularly troubled by the absence of a struggle. Miss Marple noted that while he spoke, he was repeatedly checking his pocket watch, though he had no appointments for another hour. It was the busyness of a man who was trying to fill a void in his own narrative. As she continued her walk, Miss Marple paused by the lich gate, where a small, bedraggled group of onlookers had gathered. She didn't look at the police cordons, she looked at the ground. She noticed that a specific patch of nettles near the stone wall had been crushed, but not by a foot. The pattern was flat and wide, as if a heavy piece of luggage, or perhaps a wooden crate, had rested there for a significant amount of time. This observation, combined with the scent of crushed laurel leaves Dr. Haydock had mentioned, began to form a very specific picture in her mind. Laurel leaves contained a high concentration of prussic acid, a fact well known to anyone with a passion for butterfly collecting or, indeed, for the more lethal aspects of botany. The inspector was currently focused on the obvious clues, the disgruntled gardener and the city associates with financial motives. But Miss Marple was thinking of the silver snuff-box she had seen earlier. She knew it belonged to the colonel, a man who prided himself on his military precision and his absolute disdain for Sir Richard's modern interference. Why would the colonel's snuff-box be in the grass near the body? It was a detail that felt almost too convenient, like a deliberate signpost for the police. In St. Mary Mead, when someone wanted to hide a secret, they didn't just bury it, they often tried to bury it under someone else's reputation. By the time she returned to her cottage for a light lunch, Miss Marple had synthesized several seemingly unrelated facts. She thought of the vicar's absence, the apothecary's closed shop, and the crushed nettles. The inspector was looking for a murderer, but Miss Marple was looking for a set of circumstances that had forced a respectable person into a corner. She realized that Sir Richard hadn't just been a victim of a crime, he had been the architect of a situation that had become unbearable for someone in the village. The patterns of behavior she had observed were not signs of guilt in the legal sense, but signs of a collective, suffocating fear. The early investigation was over, and the first suspects were about to be served up to the police on a silver platter. But Miss Marple knew that the real hand behind the laurel-scented death was still hidden behind a mask of impeccable village virtue. By the second afternoon, Inspector Slack had convinced himself that the investigation was nearing a triumphant conclusion. The obvious suspect had materialized in the form of the young gardener, Peter, whose history was not as pristine as his rows of summer cabbages. A search of the potting shed had revealed a hidden bottle containing a concentrated extract of crushed laurel, alongside a crumpled dismissal notice signed by Sir Richard that very evening. To the inspector, the motive and means were perfectly matched: set a hot-tempered youth, a lost livelihood, and a convenient knowledge of poisonous flora. Peter was taken into custody amidst a flurry of flashing cameras and the self-important barking of orders. The police were eager to close the case before the week was out, viewing the evidence as an insurmountable wall of guilt. Miss Marple, however, remained profoundly unconvinced as she sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking a relentless, skeptical rhythm. She had known Peter since he was a boy in short trousers, and while he was certainly prone to the occasional burst of temper, he lacked the icy calculation required for a murder of such clinical precision. To kill a man at the Lich Gate, without a struggle and with such an exotic method, suggested a mind that understood the theatre of death, not the impulsive rage of a dismissed servant. Furthermore, the discovery of the laurel extract in the potting shed felt far too deliberate, as if it had been placed there to be found by the first pair of heavy boots that came stomping through the garden. Her skepticism was further bolstered by a brief encounter with the colonel, who had stopped by her gate, ostensibly to inquire about her prize-winning delphiniums. The colonel looked remarkably composed, yet his eyes possessed a restless, searching quality that betrayed a mind in turmoil. When Miss Marple mentioned the silver snuff-box found near the body, the colonel's hand went instinctively to his empty waistcoat pocket. He claimed, with a stiff upper lip that was perhaps a fraction too rigid, that he had lost the box days ago while walking his dog. It was a statement delivered with military precision, yet it lacked the ring of truth. In St. Mary Mead, when a man like the colonel lost a treasured possession, the entire village was usually recruited to find it within the hour. Miss Marple also noted the behaviour of the vicar's wife, who had been uncharacteristically busy scrubbing the front steps of the vicarage since dawn. It was a task she usually loathed, yet she pursued it now with a frantic energy that suggested a desire to wash away more than just the morning's dust. She avoided Miss Marple's gaze, her conversation limited to the tragedy of youth regarding Peter's arrest. It was the language of a woman who had accepted a convenient narrative because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Miss Marple realized that the village was closing ranks, not out of malice toward Peter, but out of a desperate need for the status quo to be restored. If Peter was guilty, the decent people of St. Mary Mead could go back to their tea and their gossip without looking too closely at their own drawing rooms. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the green, Miss Marple observed a car leaving the north same dark saloon she had seen on the night of the murder. It belonged to Sir Richard's city associate, a man named Mr. Vance, who had stayed behind to assist Lady Trixie with the estate. Mr. Vance was a man of sharp angles and even sharper eyes, and as he drove past the garden, he offered Miss Marple a look of such calculated indifference that it chilled her more than the evening air. To the inspector, Vance was merely a witness, but to Miss Marple, he was a variable that didn't fit the village equation. He represented the modern world Sir Richard had tried to bring to St. Mary Mead, a world where secrets were assets and people were merely obstacles to be moved. She walked back into her cottage, her mind synthesizing the discordance. Police had their suspect poison and motive, but they didn't have the truth. The laurel-scented death was a puzzle where the pieces had been forced into place by a hand that knew exactly how to manipulate the village's expectations. Peter was the scapegoat, the colonel was the distraction, and the real killer was someone who had watched the entire performance from the front row. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and resumed her knitting. The investigation was not ending, it was only just beginning to move beneath the surface of the village's polite masks. She knew that the obvious suspect was merely a shadow on the wall, and that the real darkness was currently sitting in a comfortable armchair, sipping a glass of sherry and waiting for the inspector to finish his paperwork. The following morning, a persistent, drizzling rain descended upon St. Mary Mead, turning the lush gardens into a sodden landscape of drooping petals and muddy paths. While Inspector Slack was at the station, basking in the glow of what he considered a watertight case against young Peter the gardener, Miss Marple was engaged in a much more delicate task. She was sitting in the small, cluttered back room of the village apothecary, ostensibly to purchase a specific type of herbal lozenge for a non-existent cough. Mr. Gillingham, the apothecary, was a man of precise habits and a nervous disposition, and as he searched the shelves, Miss Marple's keen eyes were not on the medicine bottles but on the small, wooden counter where the local prescriptions were filed. It was here that she noticed a minor, seemingly unimportant detail that shifted the entire focus of her internal investigation. Tucked into the corner of a blotter was a small, torn fragment of a laboratory requisition form. It wasn't the form itself that caught her attention, but the date and the specific chemical notation scribbled in the margin, C3H402. To a casual observer, it was merely a scientific shorthand, but Miss Marple, who had a surprising memory for the more lethal aspects of organic chemistry, recognized it as a component used in the stabilization of certain concentrated alkaloids. More importantly, the date on the fragment was 3 days before Sir Richard's arrival in the village. This meant that someone had been preparing for a specific chemical process long before the disgruntled gardener had even received his dismissal notice. This discovery transformed the laurel-scented death from a crime of passion into a crime of meticulous preparation. Miss Marple realized that the laurel extract found in Peter's shed was likely a crude imitation, a stage prop designed to lead the police to the most convenient conclusion. The real poison had been far more sophisticated, a concentrated essence that required the specialized equipment of a laboratory or a well-stocked dispensary. She thought of Mr. Gillingham's sudden inventory closure on the morning after the murder. It wasn't that he was hiding a theft, it was that he was cleaning his equipment. But why would the apothecary, a man who lived in terror of a misplaced decimal point, risk everything to kill a man he barely knew? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in the human patterns she had observed at the vicarage and the manor. She recalled the way Lady Trixie had been talking to Peter in the gardenot, with the distance of an employer, but with a strange conspiratorial intensity. And then there was the matter of the Colonel's snuff-box. If the box had been lost days ago, as the Colonel claimed, why was it found in the grass that had been mown only that afternoon? The answer was simple. It had been planted. Someone had wanted to ensure that if Peter's guilt was questioned, the suspicion would fall squarely on the village's most prominent military figure. It was a layering of deception, a double bluff designed to keep the police spinning in circles while the real killer remained in the center of the web. As she left the apothecary's and walked through the rain, Miss Marple noticed another small detail that everyone else had overlooked. Near the lich gate, where the police had finished their search, a small discarded piece of blue silk ribbon was snagged on a briar rose. It was a very specific shade of cornflower blue, the exact color of the ribbon the vicar's wife used to tie her mourning bonnet. Miss Marple paused, her heart heavy with the implication. She remembered the vicar's wife scrubbing the steps with such frantic energy. It wasn't just dust she was washing away, it was the physical evidence of where she had been at midnight. The hidden clue of the blue ribbon and the chemical notation suggested a conspiracy that involved the most unlikely of allies. The minor detail of the requisition form pointed away from the garden and toward the professional heart of the village. Miss Marple realized that Sir Richard hadn't just been a victim of a single person's greed, he had been the victim of a collective necessity. The development of the meadow wasn't just about villas. It was about the exposure of something buried in that land something that Mr. Gillingham, the vicar's wife, and perhaps even Lady Trixie were desperate to keep hidden. The obvious suspect was a shadow, but the blue ribbon was a thread, and as Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, she began to pull on it, knowing that the entire tapestry of St. Mary Mead's respectability was about to unravel. The afternoon rains slowed to a rhythmic, hypnotic patter, creating a sense of isolation that seemed to encourage the surfacing of long-suppressed memories. Miss Marple, seated by her fireplace with a second cup of tea, found herself playing host to Mrs. Bantry, who had arrived in a state of breathless indignation. Dolly Bantry was a woman who navigated the social waters of the county with the expertise of a seasoned mariner, and her arrival usually heralded a deluge of information that the official investigation would never think to solicit. As they sat together, the conversation turned away from the gardener's arrest and toward the complex, intertwined histories of the families that had occupied St. Mary Mead long before Sir Richard's modern intrusion. It was through Dolly's rambling anecdotes that the true nature of the legacy Sir Richard had threatened began to emerge, revealing a web of relationships built on a foundation of mutual survival. According to Mrs. Bantry, the meadow that Sir Richard intended to develop was not merely a picturesque piece of grazing land. It was the site of the old Gillingham Sanatorium, a private institution that had burned down under mysterious circumstances 30 years ago. The apothecary, Mr. Gillingham, was the son of the man who had owned the facility, and it was whispered that the fire had been a convenient end to an investigation into the mismanagement of certain high-profile patients. One of those patients, it appeared, had been a distant, troubled relative of Lady Trixie and Sir Richard. If the meadow were excavated for the new villas, the foundations of the old sanatorium would be uncovered, potentially revealing the remains of those who had supposedly perished in the flames, but whose deaths had never been properly accounted for. The development was not just a threat to the view, it was a threat to the very skeletons of the village's elite. This revelation added a chilling dimension to the motives Miss Marple had been considering. The vicar's wife, she now recalled, was the daughter of the local magistrate who had presided over the perfunctory inquest following the fire. If the truth about the sanatorium were revealed, her father's professional reputation would be retroactively destroyed, and the vicar's own standing would be compromised by the inherited scandal. The village was not just protecting its peace, it was protecting a shared grave. Sir Richard, with his relentless drive for progress, was an inadvertent archaeologist about to dig up a crime that 3 different families had spent decades burying. The conspiracy of silence was not a metaphor, it was a physical reality rooted in the soil of the old meadow. Miss Marple listened as Dolly mentioned that Lady Trixie had been seen at the apothecary's shop late on the Friday before the murder, looking positively skeletal and carrying a small, heavy parcel. The pieces of the chemical notation and the laurel scent began to align with a frightening symmetry. It wasn't that one person had killed Sir Richard, it was that the necessity of his death had been recognized by a collective. Lady Trixie provided the access and the distraction, Mr. Gillingham provided the refined toxin, and the vicar's wife, perhaps driven by a frantic desire to protect her father's name, had acted as the messenger or the observer on that fatal night at the Lich Gate. They were all bound together by a single, shameful secret that Sir Richard's bulldozers were about to expose to the light of day. The psychological observation Miss Marple favoured was now pointing toward a tragedy of desperation. She thought of the young gardener, Peter, and realized he was the perfect sacrificial lamb, because he was the only one in the village who had no connection to the old fire. He was an outsider in their history, making him an easy target for their collective guilt. The Colonel's involvement took on a different light as well. His misplaced snuff-box was likely a clumsy attempt by one of the others to implicate a man whose rigid sense of honor would never allow him to tell the truth if it meant betraying the old families. The Colonel was a man who would go to the gallows to protect a lady's reputation, even a murderous one. As the evening shadows deepened, Miss Marple synthesized the discordance of these revelations. The village was a fortress built on a lie, and Sir Richard had been the invader who refused to be bribed or ignored. She realized that the another twist she sensed was coming would be a desperate attempt by the conspirators to finalize their victory. With Peter in jail and the inspector satisfied, they only had to ensure that the development project was legally halted forever. But the blue ribbon on the briar rose and the chemical fragment in the apothecary's shop were the loose threads that could bring the entire structure down. As she bid Dolly good night, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of sadness. The secrets of St. Mary Mead was not just about money or land. They were about the enduring power of shame and the lengths to which decent people would go to avoid the consequences of the past. The following evening, the persistent rain finally ceased, leaving St. Mary Mead submerged in a thick, sulphurous fog that seemed to swallow the light of the street lamps. The village remained in a state of uneasy hibernation. The residents huddled behind locked doors, yet the silence was suddenly shattered by a second, equally chilling event. At precisely 9 o'clock, the frantic ringing of the fire bell at the old mews began to toll, signaling a disaster that redirected the village's attention away from the Lich Gate, a small stone outbuilding on the edge of the contested meadow structure used by Sir Richard to store the preliminary architectural blueprints and soil survey reports was engulfed in a fierce, localized blaze. By the time the volunteer brigade arrived, the interior had been gutted, and the heavy scent of burning parchment mingled with a strange, chemical odor that Miss Marple recognized with a sinking heart. It was the smell of high-grade accelerant, the kind used in professional laboratories. Inspector Slack was on the scene within minutes, his face a mask of frustrated fury. To the official mind, this was a clear case of an accomplice attempting to destroy the evidence of the development's progress, likely another move by the gardener's supposed confederates. However, the twist came when a search of the perimeter revealed a discarded, soot-stained coat lying in the tall grass. Tucked into the pocket was a small, silver-handled magnifying glass engraved with the initials of the local apothecary, Mr. Gillingham. Even more shocking was the discovery made 20 minutes later. The apothecary himself was found slumped in his own dispensary, apparently the victim of a self-administered overdose of sedative. A suicide note was prominently displayed on his counter, in which he claimed full responsibility for Sir Richard's death, citing a long-standing personal grievance and the unbearable guilt of his actions. To the village, and certainly to Inspector Slack, this was the final piece of the puzzle. The apothecary had killed Sir Richard, and then, realizing the net was closing after the fire, had taken his own life. It was a tidy, tragic conclusion that allowed everyone to breathe a sigh of relief. The case against young Peter was immediately dropped, and the narrative of the mad scientist became the new gospel of St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple, standing on the fringe of the damp crowd, remained remarkably still. She observed the way the smoke from the outbuilding curled into the fog, and she noticed a detail that the inspector had completely overlooked in his rush to declare the case closed. The suicide note, while written in Gillingham's precise hand, was composed on a sheet of paper that bore a faint, embossed watermark of a willow tree, personal stationery of Lady Trixie at the manor. This new crime was a masterstroke of deception. By sacrificing the apothecary, the real architects of the mystery had created a perfect scapegoat who could no longer defend himself. The fire had not been about destroying blueprints. It had been a theatrical distraction to draw the village away from the apothecary's shop while the suicide was being staged. Miss Marple realized that Gillingham had not been a mastermind, but a reluctant participant who had likely threatened to confess. His death was not an act of cowardice, but a cold-blooded execution designed to seal the lips of the only man who could testify to the origins of the laurel-scented toxin. The twist had successfully reinforced the killer's deception by providing a dead man to carry the blame, effectively burying the secrets of the old sanatorium once again. As she made her way home through the gloom, Miss Marple noticed a second discrepancy. The silver-handled magnifying glass found at the fire was perfectly clean, despite being dropped in a muddy field during a rainstorm. It had been found because it was meant to be found, a deliberate signpost for the inspector. She also recalled the blue ribbon she had seen earlier on the briar rose. It was gone now, removed by a hand that was systematically cleaning up the loose threads of the conspiracy. The village was being led toward a comfortable lie, and the cry in the night was being rewritten as the act of a solitary, broken man. But Miss Marple knew that a man as nervous as Gillingham would never have had the stomach for arson, let alone the theatricality of a public Lichgate murder. The second crime had shifted the focus away from the meadow and the past, placing the burden of guilt on a single convenient grave. The inspector was already calling his superiors to report his success, but Miss Marple felt a profound sense of urgency. The real killer was now emboldened by their success, believing the apothecary's silence had secured their future. She thought of the legacy they were protecting and realized that the danger was far from over. If she didn't act soon, the truth about the sanatorium fire and Sir Richard's death would be lost forever in the fog of St. Mary Mead's collective convenience. She reached her garden gate, her mind already formulating the final test. The players had made their move, and now it was time for the quietest observer in the village to move her own piece onto the board. The following afternoon, the sun made a fleeting appearance, casting a pale, watery light over the manicured lawns of the manor. Miss Marple, carrying a small basket of her finest quince jelly, made her way up the drive with the purposeful yet unassuming gait of an elderly lady performing a neighbourly duty. She knew that Lady Trixie would be in a state of high professional composure now that the apothecary's suicide had seemingly drawn a line under the entire messy affair. It was the perfect moment to engage her in a game of psychological chess, a game played with smiles, domestic anecdotes, and the lethal precision of a well-placed question. She found Lady Trixie in the morning room, a space filled with the scent of lilies and the hushed atmosphere of a house in mourning. Though the grief felt as brittle and manufactured as a stage set, Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair, her knitting needles already beginning their rhythmic, soothing click-clack. She began to speak not of the murder, but of the nature of old family houses and the way they seemed to hold on to the past. She talked of a cousin in St. Mary Mead who had once found a hidden cellar filled with Victorian medical records, a discovery that had caused quite a stir among the local gentry. "It is a funny thing about history, Trixie," she murmured, her blue eyes fixed on the silver tea service. "One can bury it under a meadow, or even under a new wing of a house, but it has a way of seeping through the floorboards. Much like the scent of laurel leaves, it is so very difficult to wash away once it has permeated the wood." She watched Lady Trixie closely as she mentioned the apothecary's suicide note. She described the unfortunate choice of stationerized willow tree watermark and noted how the lady's hand instinctively tightened around her teacup. Miss Marple then shifted the conversation to the fire at the outbuilding, mentioning how remarkable it was that the magnifying glass had been found so easily. "It reminded me so much of poor Mr. Ebbs from the draper's shop," she mused. "He once tried to frame his assistant by leaving a pair of scissors at the scene of a theft, not realizing that he had used those very scissors to trim his own beard only an hour before. The scissors were far too clean for a man who had supposedly been cutting through heavy canvas." The reaction was exactly what she had hoped. Lady Trixie's jaw tightened, and she began a long, rambling defense of the apothecary's character, calling his death a tragic necessity for a man of such a nervous disposition. She spoke with a cold, aristocratic detachment that was entirely unconvincing, her eyes darting toward the desk where the stationery was kept. Miss Marple watched her with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a specimen. She noted the way the lady repeatedly adjusted her pearls, and the way her gaze flickered toward the window that overlooked the old meadow. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime protecting the family name, and the realization was beginning to dawn on her that her subtle redirections had been as transparent as glass to the elderly lady sitting across from her. "I suppose the architectural blueprints are quite gone now," Miss Marple continued, her voice as smooth as cream. "Turned to ash, along with the soil reports that would have shown the remains of the old sanatorium foundations. But it's a funny thing about ash, Trixie. It's very fragile, but it preserves the shape of the paper if it's handled carefully. And the blue ribbon, I found a small piece of cornflower blue ribbon on a briar rose near the lich gate. It matched your sister-in-law's bonnet perfectly, but of course she was in London that night. It makes me wonder who else in the village favours that particular shade of blue." Lady Trixie's reaction was visceral. She instinctively touched the lace at her throat, her breath hitching in her chest. For a moment, the mask of the grieving sister dropped, revealing the terrified conspirator Beniatha woman who had seen her carefully constructed silence crumbling and was now realizing she was being observed by a mind far sharper than Inspector Slack's. She began to stammer an excuse about having a headache, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as she rose to end the visit. She was a woman who had been outmaneuvered by a woman she had dismissed as a dithering old lady, and the fear in her eyes confirmed everything Miss Marple had suspected. As she rose to leave, Miss Marple declined the offer of a glass of sherry. She had seen everything she needed. Lady Trixie's reaction to the mention of the blue ribbon and the watermark had confirmed the final suspicion. The suicide had been a collaborative execution, and the lady herself had been the one to draft the note. The psychological game was over, and the suspect had revealed her hand by trying to steady it. As she stepped back out into the cool afternoon air, Miss Marple felt a profound sadness. The final revelation was now inevitable, and the secrets of the old sanatorium were about to be brought into the light of day. She had watched the predator in the drawing room, and now she only had to wait for the final, desperate move that would close the case forever. The gathering in the library of the manor that evening was conducted in a silence so brittle, it felt as though the mere clinking of a teacup would shatter the room into 1,000 pieces. Inspector Slack stood by the heavy oak mantel, his arms crossed and his face a mask of impatient skepticism, while the vicar and his wife sat on the velvet settee, looking like two people awaiting a sentence from a high court. Lady Trixie remained by the window, her back to the room, her silhouette dark against the encroaching twilight. It was into this atmosphere of suppressed terror that Miss Marple stepped, her knitting bag on her arm, and a look of profound, gentle sorrow in her eyes. She did not wait for an invitation to speak. She simply sat in the centre of the room and began to untangle the web that had strangled the peace of St. Mary Mead. "It is a very painful thing," Miss Marple began, her needles beginning their soft, rhythmic clicking, "to realize that the people we trust the most are often the ones most capable of deception. We look at a village like this and see gardens and church bells, but we forget that gardens are built over old soil. Sir Richard's murder was not an act of sudden passion by a disgruntled gardener. It was a cold, deliberated execution performed to protect a secret that has been buried for 30 years. Truth about the Gillingham sanatorium fire. You see, Sir Richard was not just building houses, he was about to dig up the evidence of a crime that involved 3 families in this very room. He was going to find the remains of those who didn't die in a fire, but who were disposed of long before the match was ever struck." Inspector Slack scoffed, but Miss Marple continued, her voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge. "The murder at the Lichgate was a masterpiece of staging. The toxin was indeed a concentrated alkaloid, but it wasn't prepared in a potting shed. It was refined in Mr. Gillingham's dispensary, under the direct supervision of Lady Trixie. Sir Richard was lured to the Lichgate by a note from his sister, a note written on the very same willow tree stationery I saw in this house yesterday. He didn't struggle because he didn't fear the person waiting for him. Someone he recognized, someone who used a poisoned needle disguised as a common brooch pin met him, and that person, Inspector, was not a man at all. It was the vicar's wife wearing a bonnet tied with a cornflower blue ribbon, the same ribbon for stays, found snagged on a briar rose near the body. The vicar's wife let out a strangled gasp, her hands flying to her throat, but Miss Marple did not flinch. You see, the vicar's wife was protecting her father's memory, the magistrate who had helped cover up the original sanatorium scandal. Lady Trixie was protecting the family name and the fortune that had been salvaged from that fire. And poor Mr. Gillingham, he was the weak link. He couldn't live with the guilt of preparing the poison, and when he threatened to go to the police, he had to be silenced. His suicide was another piece of theatre. The note was forged by Lady Trixie again, on her own distinctive paper, and the fire at the outbuilding was a distraction to ensure the village was looking elsewhere, while the doctor was being murdered in his own shop. Miss Marple looked toward the window where Lady Trixie still stood motionless. The silver snuff-box was planted to lead you to the Colonel, just as the laurel extract was planted to lead you to Peter. It was a series of double bluffs designed to keep the police spinning in circles. But the conspirators were too tidy. They left a magnifying glass at the fire that was far too clean, and they used a watermark that was far too unique. They treated the murder like a social engagement, never realizing that the small, domestic detailist colour of a ribbon, the habit of a particular pen array, the things that truly testify to the truth. Sir Richard died because he wouldn't be bribed, and Mr. Gillingham died because he couldn't be trusted. It was a communal effort of silence, where each person provided a piece of the puzzle, the means, the motive, and the opportunity. Inspector Slack moved toward the vicar's wife, who had collapsed into a fit of silent weeping, but his eyes were on Lady Trixie. The lady turned slowly, her face a mask of aristocratic defiance, even as the truth stripped her of her dignity. "You have no scientific proof," she hissed, but the inspector was already looking at the small, antique brooch pinned to her Calara pin that had been filed to a needle-sharp point and still bore a faint, waxy residue. Miss Marple sighed, her knitting needles finally coming to a rest. "Human nature is the only proof one ever needs, Trixie. We are what we hide, and in St. Mary Mead we have been hiding for a very long time." The cry in the night had finally been answered, not by a laboratory report, but by the quiet observation of a woman who knew that even the most beautiful bonnet can hide a mind filled with murder. The morning after the arrests at the manor, St. Mary Mead seemed to emerge from its sulphurous fog with a scrubbed, almost unnatural brilliance. The sun, finally conquering the autumn damp, glinted off the brass door knockers of the high street and turned the puddles on the green into shimmering mirrors of a clear blue sky. Miss Marple sat in her small breakfast parlour, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of China tea, watching the village return to its rhythmic, predictable life. To any casual observer passing through on the morning bus, the scene was one of quintessential English peace, yet Miss Marple knew that the internal geography of the village had been permanently altered. The arrest of the vicar's wife and the fall of Lady Trixie had done more than solve a murder. It had stripped away a layer of collective history that the village had spent 30 years cultivating. As she spread a thin layer of marmalade on her toast, Miss Marple observed the world outside her window with her customary keenness. She saw the postman making his rounds, pausing for a significantly longer time at each gate to exchange the latest filtered details of the Manor House scandal. The human capacity for absorbing tragedy and converting it into social currency never ceased to amaze her. Already the narrative was being reshaped. The villagers were convincing themselves that they had always sensed something unstable about the vicar's wife, conveniently forgetting the years of tea parties and parish meetings they had shared in perfect, polite harmony. It was a necessary form of self-delusion, a way for the village to protect its own ego from the realization that they had nurtured a conspiracy of silence in their very midst. Later that afternoon, the colonel came to call. He looked like a diminished man, his military bearing replaced by a hollow, searching expression. They sat in the garden, the late October sun offering more light than warmth. He spoke of the unravelling of the old guard, his voice heavy with the burden of his own earlier attempts to protect reputations that were no longer worth saving. He confessed that he had felt a duty to the old families, a duty that had almost cost an innocent lad his life. Miss Marple listened with a sympathetic tilt of her head, but her words were characteristically candid. She reminded him that loyalty is a fine thing, but when it is used to shield a crime, it becomes a cage rather than a fortress. The truth, she suggested, was not the enemy of tradition, but its only true guarantor. The meadow that had caused so much bloodshed was now a site of sombre official activity. Sir Richard's development plans had been halted indefinitely, not by a protest, but by the legal reality of the evidence uncovered beneath its soil. Excavation had begun, but not for villas. They were searching for the remains that the sanatorium fire had failed to fully erase. The young gardener, Peter, had been released with a formal apology and a small purse of money collected by the more conscience-stricken members of the parish. Miss Marple had seen him earlier that day, walking with a newfound uprightness, no longer the invisible labourer, but a man who had stared down a hanging rope and won. It was a small victory for justice, but in Miss Marple's experience, small victories were often the only ones that truly mattered in the long run. As the sun began to dip behind the spire of the church, casting long purple shadows across the garden, Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. Of Sir Richard, a man who had come to the village to build a future, and had instead unearthed a lethal past. He had been a man of iron and progress, yet his death had been caused by the most delicate of weapons, a brooch pin and a ribbon. It was a classic irony of human nature that we are often most vulnerable to the things we consider most trivial. Sir Richard had ignored the village ladies and their small-town concerns, never realizing that those very concerns were the armor that protected a 30-year-old secret. St. Mary Mead would continue, of course. There would be a new vicar's wife, eventually, and perhaps even a new squire for the manor. The story of the cry in the night would become just another piece of local lore, told to newcomers over a pint at the Blue Boar. But for now, the village was in a state of honest reflection. Miss Marple felt a sense of quiet satisfaction as she finished the final row of her soft grey wool scarf. Human patterns of behaviour were as predictable as the seasons. While the faces changed, the motives remained the same: fear, pride, and the desperate desire to keep the past in the dark. She blew out her lamp, the scent of the extinguished wick reminding her briefly of the smoke from the outbuilding, and settled into the darkness. The mystery was closed, the ledger was balanced, and the quiet village was, at long last, at peace with its ghosts.